They identified her by a slipper. 9 women died in the fire at Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, on the night of March 10, 1948. The heat had taken some of them too completely for anyone to recognize. For one of the dead, the coroner used dental records. By the surviving accounts, he also used a single charred slipper, found beneath what was left of her body in the rubble of the 5th floor. 28 years earlier, that same woman had been on the cover of every newspaper in America. Photographers chased her through Manhattan. A young writer in love with her had named a generation after the way she danced. Her windows had been chained shut. Her corridor doors had been locked. The sedative she had been given that night was strong enough to keep her under as the fire climbed. There is a transcript in an archive at Princeton University. 114 pages, typed by a stenographer in May of 1933, 15 years before the fire. In it, her husband repeats one phrase to her in front of her doctor. He calls it unconditional surrender. She had not done anything wrong. She had written a book. They were erased on purpose. We're undoing it on purpose. Subscribe to Old Money Secrets. For most of the 20th century, the world agreed on who Zelda Fitzgerald was. The wife. That came first. Wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, the man who wrote The Great Gatsby, the man who named the Jazz Age, the man whose face still appears on the back of paperback copies in every airport bookstore in America. The inspiration. That came second. The flapper from Montgomery, Alabama, who married the handsome young writer in 1920, danced on the roofs of taxicabs in Manhattan, and dove into the fountain at the Plaza Hotel in her evening dress. Newspapers called her the first American flapper. Scott did not correct them. He had given them the phrase. The muse. That came third. Every blonde, reckless, beautiful, doomed woman in his novels was supposed to be her. Daisy Bucha. Nan in The Great Gatsby. Nicole Diver in Tender is the Night. Girls who broke things and walked away and ruined men. Scott was the writer. Zelda was the material. That was the arrangement, and for a long time no one questioned it. And the Mad Woman. That came last, and that explained everything else. By the accepted version, the breakdown began in 1930, in Paris. Ballet too late, too hard, too obsessively for a woman of 30. The dancing was the cause. The dancing had revealed something underneath that had been there all along. A clinic in Switzerland. A famous psychiatrist named Dr. Oscar Farrell. A diagnosis of schizophrenia, though modern doctors believe what she actually had was bipolar disorder. The label did not matter. The diagnosis did. From that point on, anything Zelda said about her own life could be questioned, edited, or set aside. Scott told the story of the marriage after that. He told it in interviews. He told it in letters to his friends. He told it most powerfully in his 1934 novel Tender is the Night, where a brilliant young psychiatrist marries a beautiful, wealthy patient, and she slowly destroys him with her madness. The book was read as autobiography. It still is. In the version that was passed down, Scott was the long-suffering husband. He paid the bills. He visited the hospitals. He kept writing while his wife fell apart. He drank too much, but who could blame him? His wife was insane. His wife was destroying his career. His wife had to be locked away. For her own good. And that story survived. His biographers wrote it decade after decade. The dust jackets and the documentaries repeated it. He was famous. He was charming. He gave the interviews. He wrote letters to Ernest Hemingway, to the editor Maxwell Perkins, to every critic in America, and in those letters he described his wife the way he wanted her described. In one of them, preserved in the published correspondence, he wrote that Zelda now claimed to be in direct contact with H. Christ, William the Conqueror, Mary Stuart, Apollo, and what he called all the stock paraphernalia of insane asylum jokes. Read that line again. Insane asylum jokes. That was how the husband described his wife to his friends. Those friends went on to write books. Those friends went on to be quoted and requoted and footnoted in every biography of the Fitzgeralds for the next 60 years. They shaped what the world remembered. In 1948, when she died in the fire at Highland Hospital, the obituaries told the same story one last time. Wife of, inspiration for, muse of, the flapper who could not stop dancing. 9 women died in that fire. Hers was the only name most papers printed. 47 years old. Institutionalized on and off for 18 years. One novel published in her own name, and almost no one had read it. That was what the world was told. The first crack in it came from a manuscript she had sent to a publisher in 1932. A manuscript her husband never saw before it left her hands. March 1932. The Phipps Clinic at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. Zelda Fitzgerald was a voluntary patient. 31 years old. Phipps was the psychiatric wing of one of the most prestigious hospitals in America. It was where the rich went when they could no longer hide what was happening at home. Zelda had checked herself involuntarily a few weeks earlier after another collapse. The clinic gave her a room and a routine. As part of her treatment, she was permitted to spend roughly 2 hours a day writing. The writing was meant to be therapeutic, a way to organize her thoughts, a way to keep her hands occupied. She used those 2 hours to write a novel. The archive at Scribner's holds the manuscript she sent to an editor named Maxwell Perkins. A novel called Save Me the Waltz, written during January and February of that year, partly at home in Montgomery and partly in the hospital. The version Perkins first received had not been read by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The R. Eason, by the scholarly account, was simple. Zelda was anxious to succeed without her husband's help. This is the first wrong thing. In the official story, Zelda is sick. Zelda is the patient. Zelda has lost touch with reality. Zelda cannot focus, cannot work, cannot finish what she starts. But the woman in the dated letters and the dated postmarks and the dated drafts in the Princeton archive wrote a full novel in 6 weeks. From inside a psychiatric hospital. In 2-hour increments. Well enough that the most powerful editor in America, the man who had edited The Great Gatsby itself, was willing to read it. The book she wrote at Phipps was a story about a woman who marries a successful artist, gives up her own ambitions, and tries, too late, to become something on her own. The protagonist, Alabama Beggs, is a Southern girl who learns ballet in her late 20s and almost makes it as a professional dancer in Naples, Italy. In real life, Zelda had been offered a solo role with the San Carlo Opera Ballet in Naples in 1929. She had turned it down. In the novel, Alabama takes the offer. Whatever Zelda was working through in those 6 weeks at the Phipps Clinic, she was working through the question of what her life might have been if she had said yes. She finished the manuscript. She wrote a letter to Scott while she was finishing it. I am proud of my novel, but I can hardly restrain myself enough to get it written. You will like it. It is distinctly a Call Fitzgerald, though more ecstatic than yours, perhaps too much so. She mailed the manuscript to Scribner's on March 9, 1932. She did not send a copy to her husband first, and she sent it to him without asking her husband. That detail by itself is small. A wife sends a book to a publisher. So what? The reason it matters is what happens 4 days later. The Scribner's correspondence files preserve a letter dated March 16, 1932. Scott Fitzgerald to Maxwell Perkins. He had just learned about the manuscript. He instructed the editor not to make any decisions about the book until it had been revised. The book was not his. He had not been asked his opinion of it. He had not been given any role in its publication. His first action, on learning that his wife had written a novel, was to write to her publisher and tell him to wait. The letter survives. Dated. Signed. A few weeks later, Scott wrote to Perkins again. The second letter is preserved in the same files. He said, turning up in a novel signed by my wife as a somewhat anemic portrait painter with a few ideas lifted from Clive Bell, Ledger, etc. puts me in an absurd and Zelda in a ridiculous position. The mixture of fact and fiction is calculated to ruin us both, or what is left of us, and I can't let it stand. Read that last phrase again. I can't let it stand. He had not written this book. His wife had written this book. He had not been consulted about this book. And he was telling her publisher, his publisher, the same man who had edited The Great Gatsby, that he would not allow it to go out. Someone signed this letter. Someone knew. The cover story for the next 90 years would be that Scott was protecting Zelda from herself. That he was helping her. That his interventions in the manuscript were editorial, a husband's gentle hand. That story would be repeated in biography after biography, as recently as the 1990s. But in the spring of 1932, before any of those biographies were written, a 31-year-old woman in a hospital in Baltimore was writing letters of her own. Letters that were also dated, also signed, also archived. In one of them, she tried to explain to her husband why she had not shown him the manuscript first. What she wrote does not match the official story. It does not match it at all. The letter sits in the Princeton archive. By the dating of scholar Matthew Bruckley, it was almost certainly written in March of 1932. Zelda is writing to Scott. He has just demanded to know why he had not been shown the book first. She tells him. She explains. "Purposely I didn't," she wrote, "knowing that you were working on your own and honestly feeling that I had no right to interrupt you to ask for a serious opinion. Also, I know that Max will not want it and I prefer to do the corrections after having his opinion. That is the practical reason." The letter goes further. "I was also afraid we might have touched on the same material. Also, feeling it to be a dubious production due to my own instability, I did not want a scathing criticism such as you to have mercilessly. If for my own good, given my last stories, poor things. I have had enough discouragement, generally, and could scream with that sense of inertia that hovers over my life and everything I do. Read it slowly." A woman in a psychiatric hospital, writing to her husband, explaining why she did not show him her novel. The reason she gives is not paranoia. The reason she gives is memory. She had shown him her work before. He had torn it apart. The criticism had been merciless. She could not face it again. This is not someone who has lost touch with reality. This is someone who has been ground down by something, and who knows exactly what is doing the grinding. There is more. A biographer named Sally Klein, going through the Princeton archive in the early 2000s, found something previous scholars had glossed over. Manuscript pages. Not just for the novel, for short stories. Stories that had been published with Scott's name on them. Stories that had been published sometimes with both their names. Klein argued the work was not inspired by Zelda's writing, as Scott's defenders had claimed for decades. It was, in many cases, direct borrowing of her lines. On some of those manuscript pages, in Zelda's own handwriting, she had crossed out Scott's name and written her own. She had written no. In the margins, she had written me. The pages survived. The corrections survived. The handwriting survived. What had been treated, for 60 years, as a literary collaboration was something else. By the manuscript record, it was a one-way transfer. And there is one more thing in that archive. The worst of them. During Zelda's earlier hospitalization at the Prangens Clinic in Switzerland, in 1930, she had participated in talk therapy sessions with her husband and the psychiatrist. Those sessions were recorded by a stenographer. By scholarship on the manuscripts, Scott later poached dialogue word for word from the transcripts of those recorded sessions for his novel Tender is the Night, published in 1934. Read that slowly. The therapy sessions in which his wife described to a doctor her own breakdown, her own hallucinations, her own grief, her own fear were transcribed. He was given copies. And when he sat down to write his novel about a brilliant psychiatrist and his beautiful, broken wife, he reached for those transcripts. He used her voice. The words she had spoken to a doctor, in confidence, while she was ill. He put them in the mouth of his fictional medwoman. The book won acclaim. The book is still taught in universities. The book is still on the shelves of every bookstore in America. The transcripts survive too. They are in the archive. The wording matches. For decades, when Zelda told people her husband had taken her work and called it his own, the answer was that this was the paranoid claim of a sick woman. But the manuscripts are dated. The transcripts are dated. The handwriting is hers. She was not paranoid. She was the only one in the room telling the truth. What he did is documented. May 1933. After the publication of Save Me the Waltz and after its critical failure, Scott Fitzgerald arranged a meeting with his wife and her psychiatrist. He hired a stenographer to record it. The transcript runs to 114 pages. By biographer Sally Klein's account, it reads more like a trial than a negotiation. In that document, Scott demanded what he called unconditional surrender. He accused Zelda of being an opportunist. He called her a third-rate writer. He called her a useless society woman. He said this in front of her doctor. He said this knowing the stenographer was recording. Zelda was still a hospital patient, still being treated. Still, in the technical sense, his wife, meaning that under the laws of 1933, he had legal authority over her care, her movements, and her access to the outside world. In that room, in front of the man treating her, he was telling her she was nothing. "It seems to me," she replied in the transcript, "that you are making rather a violent attack on a third-rate talent then. That sentence should be in every biography of F. Scott Fitzgerald. It is in almost none of them. The transcript runs longer than the moment of that exchange. Across 114 pages, the same arguments repeat. Scott explained to the doctor that he was a professional novelist. He explained that Zelda was an amateur. He explained that the marriage could not have two writers in it competing for the same material. He proposed terms. He kept proposing terms. At one point, by Klein's account of the document, Zelda asked a simple question. She asked whether she might be permitted to write at all, whether she could write, perhaps, on subjects that did not overlap with his work. She was told the answer would depend on what she wrote. She would have to clear her topics first. The doctor, a man named Dr. Thomas Rennie, who had been treating Zelda at the Phipps Clinic, was present throughout. He took Scott's side on most of the major points. The transcript records him agreeing that the marriage required Zelda to step back from her writing for the sake of her husband's career and her own recovery. He framed it as a treatment recommendation. That was a doctor speaking to his patient. That was the opinion the patient was meant to accept. The transcript ended with what Scott wanted. By the surviving record, Zelda agreed not to write any more fiction that drew on the same material her husband intended to use. She agreed to stay away from his territory. She agreed, in effect, to stop competing with him for the story of their own life. She would not publish another novel in her lifetime. That was what he did. What she tried to do is also documented. After 1933, Zelda kept writing. Manuscripts in the archive show it clearly. She tried a stage play called Scandalabra. Broadway producers rejected it. Her husband arranged for it to be staged by a small theater group in Baltimore. The reviews were bad. She tried to paint. When her artwork was exhibited in New York in March of 1934, 13 paintings and 15 drawings. The New Yorker described the work merely as paintings by the almost mythical Zelda Fitzgerald. No actual description of the paintings was provided. The magazine reviewed the legend, not the work. She kept writing letters. Hundreds of them. She kept journals. She started a second novel, Caesar's Things, which she would never finish. The unfinished manuscript of Caesar's Things sits in the Princeton archive. It is the closest thing to a confession Zelda ever wrote. The book was about a woman whose life had been split in two by a man, who tried to find herself in religion, who circled and circled the same wound without ever quite naming it. She had been working on it since the early 1940s. By 1947, she was reportedly still revising the same opening chapters. Scholars who have read what survives describe it as fragmented, repetitive, sometimes brilliant, often unfinishable. It is unfinishable for a specific reason. By 1933, Zelda had been forbidden, in writing in front of witnesses, from using the autobiographical material that her life had given her. The transcript said so. The agreement said so. She could not write the book of her own life because the book of her and life had been ruled, by stenographic record, to belong to her husband. What she tried to do instead was to write around it, to approach the truth from oblique angles, to disguise it, to try, in fragments, to say what she had been told she could not say. The fragments are in the archive. They are dated. They never resolve. She tried, again and again, to be heard in her own voice. What was covered up is also documented. Scott's letters to Perkins, to Hemingway, to her psychiatrists, they survive. In them he repeatedly described Zelda as the source of his suffering. He described her writing as derivative of his. He described her madness as the central fact of her life. His own letters from the same period describe his drinking, his missed deadlines, His suicide attempt, which, by the published record, involved a small bottle of morphine that only made him vomit. Her diagnosis became the public story. Her instability made it into the published books. His did not. His was kept quieter. There is one editorial line I have to put down here. This is the document that changed everything for me. The 1933 transcript. Not because it is the worst thing in the archive, there are worse things, but because it is the only one where you can hear all three voices in the same room. The husband, the doctor, and the wife who was still trying, on page after page, to defend her right to write a book. The doctor sided with the husband. That is also in the file. What was destroyed, no one can say. The original manuscripts of Save Me the Waltz are missing, the typescripts she sent to Perkins before any revisions. By Bruckley's note on the text, those originals have disappeared. We do not know who destroyed them. We do not know when. What survived? Survived by accident. The Scribner's correspondence was kept because Scribner's keeps everything. The 1933 transcript was kept because the doctor kept his own copy. The letters in Princeton were kept because someone in the family, we are not entirely sure who, could not bring themselves to throw them away. If those things had been destroyed, the official story would still be intact today. We are very close to never having known any of this at all. There is one more thing the file shows, the hardest one to put down. For 18 years, at the Phipps Clinic in Baltimore, at Shepherd Pratt outside Baltimore, at Highland Hospital in Asheville, at the various sanatoriums of Europe and America, someone had to pay for Zelda's care. Private rooms, round-the-clock staff, specialists, insulin shock therapy, electroshock therapy, the medications, the transportation between facilities. The bills did not stop. Scott paid them. The accounting is preserved in his own letters and in the Scribner's correspondence. He paid them by writing magazine stories because his novels were not selling. He moved to Hollywood in 1937 to write screenplays for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer for a fee of $1,000 a month because the bills for Zelda's care kept coming and someone had to write the checks. That fact has been used for 90 years to defend him. The file shows something underneath it. The bills he was paying were the bills for treating a woman whose words he had taken. The novels she could not write because she had been forbidden in a stenographer's transcript to write about the same material he was using, were novels that might have earned money themselves. The career she could not have was a career that had been actively prevented. He was paying the hospital bills of a writer he had silenced. The hospital bills were the cost of the silence. That is in the file too, not stated outright, not in any single document, but assembled piece by piece from the dated correspondence and the dated manuscripts and the dated transcripts. It is unmistakable. There is one more figure worth setting down because it makes the rest concrete. By 1936, when Zelda was first admitted to Highland Hospital, the reported cost of her care was running to thousands of dollars a year, at a moment when the United States was still in the Depression, and a working family in North Carolina was lucky to bring in $2,000 a year total. Scott was writing magazine pieces at $500 apiece, sometimes more, to keep the bills paid. The arithmetic worked. The arithmetic was exhausting. The arithmetic depended, in the end, on Zelda staying in the hospital and Scott staying at his desk. The arrangement was sustainable for one of them. The other one was running out of time. This act belongs to Zelda. In the spring of 1932, while she was finishing Save Me the Waltz in a hospital in Baltimore, she wrote a sentence into the novel that has been quoted ever since. Nobody has measured, not even poets, how much the heart can hold. The book was reviewed badly. It sold around 1,300 copies. Her royalty came to $120.73. That was the only money Zelda ever made from a book published in her own name. Her letters from the hospitals, and there are hundreds of them in the Princeton archive, dated and signed and stored in folders, are filled with what she could see from her window. The weather. Her daughter, Scotty, whom she was rarely allowed to see. The smell of pencils and tweed, which made her think of her husband when they were young. In December of 1940, just before he died, Zelda wrote to Scott, "I am sorry that there should be nothing to greet you but an empty shell. I love you anyway, even if there isn't any me or any love or Eve. And any life. I love you." Read it twice. Even if there isn't any me. A woman writing from inside a place where herself had been disassembled. By her illness, yes. But also, the file suggests, by what had been done to her. By the husband who had told her, on a stenographer's transcript, that she was a third-rate talent. By the doctors who had sided with him. By the world that believed him. In those same letters, Zelda wrote about her writing. She knew what had been taken. She referred to it indirectly, she had to, but in the surviving correspondence she made it clear that she understood what had happened to her work. There is a line of hers, quoted by biographers, that bears repeating. Her husband, she said, seemed to believe that plagiarism began at home. She said it as a joke. The joke was true. She wrote about the hospitals. 18 years of them. By the late 1930s, Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, the place where she would eventually die. She wrote about the mountains. About the wildflowers she collected on long walks with her mother. A friend from the hospital, a woman named Edna, recalled later that Zelda talked a lot about writing and dancing, about her life in Paris. She made friends. She took long walks. She collected wildflowers. She was, in Edna's words, crazy about wildflowers. She kept writing. The unfinished manuscript of Caesar's Things, her second novel, sits in the archive. She had been working on it for years. It was never finished. Her last letter was written on March 9, 1948. It was to her daughter. That month, the doctors at Highland Hospital had told Zelda she was well enough to be discharged. She had decided to stay a few more weeks, just to be sure she was ready. In that last letter, she wrote, "There is promise of spring in the air and an aura of sunshine over the mountains. The mountains seem to hold more weather than elsewhere, and time and retrospect flood roseate down the long hillsides." She mailed it. She never wrote. Another. She wrote it the day before she died. The fire started in the kitchen. It was the night of March 10, 1948. The central building at Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. The night nurse on duty, a woman named Doris Anderson, had been hired 9 days earlier. It was her first night in charge of the building. As part of her round, she had administered a strong sedative to the patients on the 5th floor, including Zelda Fitzgerald. The sedative was, by her later testimony, standard practice for inducing sleep. At about 11:30 in the evening, Anderson smelled smoke. She found the fire on the 3rd floor in what was called the diet kitchen. By her testimony, at that moment the fire was confined to a 3-by-5-foot table. Anderson had received no firefighting training. She testified later that because she was frightened, she made no attempt to extinguish it. 25 minutes passed before the fire department arrived. By then, flames were bursting through the roof. The fire moved through the dumbwaiter shaft. The dumbwaiter ran from the kitchen on the 3rd floor up through every floor of the building, all the way to the 5th, where Zelda lay sedated. The flames roared up the shaft and burst out onto each floor. The stairways were cut off almost immediately. The fire escapes were made of wood. The wood caught fire. The fire escapes burned along with the building. The firefighters could not get to the women on the upper floors. Their efforts were hindered by the surviving newspaper accounts, by the building's screened porches and chain-shackled windows. The chains had been put there to keep the patients from jumping to their deaths. When the fire came, the chains stayed. The corridor doors were locked. The building did not have alarms. The building did not have sprinklers. Zelda had been sedated. She was on the 5th floor. By surviving reports, she had been possibly awaiting electroshock therapy. She did not get out. 9 women died. She was identified by her dental records and, by other accounts, by a single charred slipper found in the rubble. The investigation followed. A jury found that there was negligence, but not to the extent to be classified as culpable negligence. The Asheville Citizen wrote that it seemed a tragedy of errors, most of them human and some of them widely shared, built up the fabric of the Highland disaster. A tragedy of errors. That was the verdict. Errors. 9 women, sedated, in a building with chained windows and locked corridor doors and wooden fire escapes and no alarms and no sprinklers. In a hospital that had been treating mentally ill women for decades. Errors. A month after the fire, the night supervisor, a woman named Willie Mae Hall, walked into the police station in Asheville and asked to be locked up. She told the officers there were 6 places in one of the patient buildings she had picked out that could be set on fire. She said she had thought about it so much, she was afraid of what she might do. When the police asked whether she had set fire to the central building on the night of March 10th, she said, "I don't know. I really don't know. I don't believe I did, but I could have." Officers questioned her for 6 hours. They put her in the county jail. They reopened the investigation. It was eventually closed without charges. The cause of the fire was never definitively established. The official record lists it as undetermined. That was the last entry. Highland Hospital had been Zelda's home, on and off, for more than a decade. The chains on the windows, the wooden fire escapes, the locked corridor doors, the absent alarms, the missing sprinklers. None of these were new failures. None of them had been installed in the days before March 10, 1948. The building had been treating mentally ill women since 1904. The conditions that killed Zelda and 8 others had existed for decades, and no one had ever been required to fix them. The investigation, in the end, found errors, not negligence. Errors. That was the last word the law had on the subject. This is what the cold open document was. The 114-page transcript from May of 1933. The record in which a husband demanded the unconditional surrender of his wife in front of her doctor, and got it. That transcript is the reason we know what was taken from her. Not just the manuscripts, not just the lines, not just the credit, the larger thing, the right to her own version of her own life. It survived because the doctor kept his copy. If he had not, her husband's books would still be the only account that mattered, and his version of her would be calling itself the truth. Scott had died 8 years before the fire. December 1940. Hollywood. A heart attack at the age of 44. He had been working on a screenplay. He left behind an unfinished novel about a film producer. Zelda outlived him by 7 years and 3 months. For most of that time, she was inside the hospital that would eventually burn down around her. What had been taken from her, she could not get back. What she had tried to write after him, she could not finish. The fire took the rest. It took until 1970 for someone to go back into the archives. A biographer named Nancy Milford spent years reading the letters, the manuscripts, the transcripts, the medical records. The book she produced, simply called Zelda, was a finalist for the National Book Award. It was the first time the materials in the archive, the letters, the drafts, Zelda's own voice, had been read carefully against the official version. The official version did not survive the reading. After Milford's biography, scholars began looking at Zelda's work in a new light. The novel was reissued. Her paintings were exhibited in the United States and in Europe. Her letters were collected and published. The unfinished second novel, Caesar's Things, was studied. In 1992, she was inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame. It came too late for the manuscripts that were destroyed. Too late for the credit she did not receive in her lifetime. Late for the years she spent inside hospitals on sedatives, being told by doctors that her own version of her own life was a symptom. But it came in time for her name to mean something more than wife of. The file shows now what the file always showed, for anyone who looked. A woman who wrote a novel in 6 weeks, in a psychiatric ward, and sent it to one of the best editors in America without asking permission. A husband who took her words from therapy transcripts and put them in his books. A meeting in 1933, recorded by a stenographer, in which she was told to surrender her right to write about her own life, and in which her own doctor did not defend her. A fire in 1948 in a building with chains on the windows. A woman sedated on the 5th floor. A slipper in the rubble. And it was hers. She wrote her own ending on March 9, 1948, in the last letter she ever sent. She did not know it was an ending. She thought it was a description of the weather. She was writing to her daughter. There is promise of spring in the air, and an aura of sunshine over the mountains. The mountains seem to hold more weather than elsewhere, and time and retrospect flood roseate down the long hillsides. That is the last thing she wrote. That is in the record too.